Well, tonight we are going to get back to natural law ethics, sort of on the main track. I always had the difficulty, I confess, in having a great deal of enthusiasm when studying the history of philosophy, because by and large it's the study of the history of errors. And I always kind of thought that if you're studying philosophy, you ought to be seeking the truth. Now, we've gotten so accustomed to the idea of examining these historical positions that we sometimes forget that if you were looking at any other science, you wouldn't waste your time doing it. Think about it. Chemistry, physics, do you spend all your time studying all the erroneous theories that have been proposed down through history? Presumably you study that which we believe to be the closest approximation to truth available today. But when it comes to philosophy, heavens no, you've got to look at every conceivable position that can be taken. And of course, simply to say that there are sciences in philosophy is to assert that there is a regimen of truth. And so when you examine metaphysics and cosmology and ethics and epistemology, you are not really studying the history of various positions, but you are, or at least ought to be, studying the truth. You ought to be studying a systematic presentation, step by step, of what the mind logically goes through in coming to understand the various subject matter that you're dealing with. So it's kind of an anomalous circumstance, perhaps testifying to the difficulty of the operation of the human mind that we spend so much time looking at all these various historical positions. One thing to remember too about the history is you don't have to know all 2,000 positions. It's sort of like looking at a river that takes various branches. If you know which way a certain branch is going and you don't want to go that way, you don't have to go down every tributary of the branch. You only have to say that's not one way we're going. And so it is with philosophical systems. There are major points of division that one can examine, and if you know that a particular direction is really heading in the wrong way, you don't have to study every detail of that direction, nor for that matter do you have to study every detail of a given philosopher in order to know that perhaps what he's doing basically is off track. And it's like studying Kant. Kant's got a million subdivisions within his philosophy, but you don't have to study all of them if you understand basically how he plays the game, and that can be done in relatively short order. I would say that his starting point is sufficiently flawed that you'd really be wasting a good portion of your life to study every detail of what he infers from that starting point. But of course, it's not a popular thing to say today that there is such a thing as truth, or that there's such a thing as absolute truth, or that the human mind can know it, and that we can systematically proceed in the investigation of truth. But as you can see in the case of ethics, if every position that is possible is to be explored, you'd never get done with the subject matter. And in a sense, a lot of people today think of ethics as being what happens on one of these talk shows where every possible position is presented. And even the most obnoxious positions are considered to be creditable. So taking a very different point of departure, we start with the foundation principles of metaphysics. If you look on page 8 of your notes, metaphysics is really the foundation of ethics. In ethics, we seek that which is leading man to happiness by understanding that which is perfective of human nature. But in order to understand what is perfective of human nature, what you're saying is what brings out the maximum perfection, which is the maximum being, the fulfillment of all of the potentialities for being that are found within the human person. And in saying that, what you're saying is you're looking for the maximization of being. And being is the subject matter of metaphysics. So you're really examining man from the standpoint of his being and that which is the good of his being. And remember, the good is convertible with being. So really there's a metaphysical root here. I was a bit hesitant to go into courses in metaphysics in ethics after spending much of my time teaching in other subject matters. And I remember discussing this with Dr. Waters, and he said, well, look, your focus is in metaphysics. And if you are a halfway decent metaphysician, you ought to be a pretty good ethician. And I didn't fully grasp what he was saying there until I started going through the ethics and began to see, yes, that's how it works. One of the things we may get to this evening is a study of the principle of double effect. And double effect is all in terms of being. If you don't grasp the pursuit of being within its application, you'll never understand double effect or why it even has application to ethics. And the principles of being, remember, point 2 here, are also the principles of reason. It's not like reason does one thing and being does something else. Of course, the ultimate being is also pure reason, which is God himself. The laws of being are the laws of reason. So, for example, in metaphysics, we state the principle of non-contradiction as a being cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. In reason, the corresponding logical principle is that you cannot simultaneously affirm and deny the same predicate of the same subject. That's just the principle of non-contradiction, but applied to the enunciation or the judgment. And we will use reason. Reason as the instrument by which we understand human nature. We apply it to human nature, as you know, Dr. Waters so frequently said, human nature adequately understood. We have to understand it as it actually is. One of the problems with many of these other so-called systems of ethics that we were looking at in the previous class is that they're partial. They may talk about just seeking pleasure, or they may talk about seeking that which promotes the greatest good for the greatest number, or they may talk about that which is the greatest good for me. But each of these is a partial glimpse. It's a partial principle. It's a partial expression, something that applies to ethics, but it's not the whole game. Saying that we are trying to produce the greatest good for the greatest number doesn't address the question of, well, can you do anything in doing this? Is it licit to use any means to get to any end that you desire? And of course, where is the division between ethics from the standpoint of the formation of the subjective conscience, or, on the other hand, ethics as an objective set of truths? How does that fit together? Many of these ethical systems don't really address this kind of question. And so what we are trying to do is to examine the science of ethics according to natural law, which simply means according to human nature, in all of its dimensions, all of the things that are pertinent to the ethical decision and man living as a ethically perfective being. So we want to apply reason to human nature. The elements of human nature, as you can see, entail the rational, the sensory, and the vegetative. What we're looking at really are the powers that we find in a human being. Natures are stable. Nature is simply, to come back to metaphysics, the way that God made something. And if you want to understand human nature, we understand it not so much in terms of just what we look like or the physical things that are found in our nature. We see it primarily in terms of the powers that we exercise as a human being. And we know that we share certain powers with vegetables Vegetables have nutrition, growth, and reproduction, so do we. But we transcend the vegetables because we also have sentient powers, powers by which we perceive the world around us in a sensory way, and by which we are able to move ourselves, self-motion, locomotion, by which we are able to use our arms and our legs and our various muscles to accomplish certain things in the world as we want to. Under the sensory, we have the cognitive, which are the knowing powers, and also the affective, which are the powers by which we are drawn towards sensible goods or moved away from sensible evils. The cognitive powers are aimed at sensible objects. And in these powers, these we share with animals. Animals have sense perception, animals have sense appetite. So do we. And if you're going to have a complete understanding of man, you must include these powers, just as you must include the vegetative powers. But in addition to those, we have certain powers that distinguish us as human. And these, of course, again, are cognitive and appetitive, but we refer to them as the intellect, technically two intellects, and the will. We don't need to know about both intellects in this course. So here we have a whole set of powers. I think there's about 17 of them. And if you're talking about putting man together properly, all of these have to be brought into proper perspective. For example, one of the vegetative powers is nutrition. And that means, believe it or not, we have to eat. And then you might say, well, what on earth has that got to do with ethics? But I mean, that's so low down, who cares? But at the same time, if we are to exercise the fullness of our life in an intellectual and volitional way, we have to be well enough to do it, and that means we need to eat. So we have to use this power of nutrition in a proper, reasonable way for the perfection of our whole being. Now that means we have to eat enough of the right food to maintain health and physical activity, but on the other hand, we have to make sure we don't eat too much and of the wrong food, because that would be a detriment to our health. So ethics has to do with using right reason to determine as mundane a thing as eating, how to eat properly, reasonably. We hear today that, 1/3 of Americans are obese or on the way to obesity. Well, that would seem to indicate perhaps something wrong. I don't want to accuse people of ethical violations, but it would seem at least that we are somehow not using reason properly with reference to the nutritive powers. Whether that's entirely in our control is another question, because you see, you can determine what is reasonable and right, and then you get into the other question, well, if I don't do something reasonable and right, is it my fault? You see, because that gets us into the question of imputability and the criteria of responsibility and so forth. Modifiers of responsibility, which could affect the degree to which we may be eating too much because we have uncontrollable compulsions. Now, if they're truly uncontrollable, then they are not subjectively imputable from the standpoint of a violation of ethics. But nonetheless, the problem is, even though we may not be responsible for doing something wrong, the natural effect of having done it is still there. It's like the person who commits suicide while insane. Well, you can't blame them, but they're still dead. So you get certain natural effects of acts, whether you can help it or not. All right, let's go over to page 9. So we look at this ordering of all these various powers, the vegetative, the sensitive, the intellective, all of these acting together, if they are used properly, order us towards our last end. And therefore, as it says, acts which disturb this order, interfere with our heading towards the last end, and to that extent they are what we call morally evil. So if we engage in activities that impede the attainment of the perfection, the full perfection of our nature, this may be a matter of moral iniquity, and thus those who expend their fortune in gambling and drink and habits of bad health and engage in warfare with their neighbors and tell lies, all of these forms of behavior contradict the perfection, the order, the proper totality which should be present in the human person, and hence make us less worthy, less ordered towards our last end, which, as we've seen earlier, ultimately is God, not in this life, but in the life to come, because man's last end is not attained and not attainable in this end, in this life. In order to understand human nature, we have to consider, under G, the relationship that we have not only within ourselves with the various powers in relation to the totality of our being, but also in relation to other things. First of all, in relation to God. Secondly, in relation to other human beings. That has to do with social ethics. And thirdly, even in relation to lower things. Now, that gets into the questions of things like ecology. And you do get into debates where people will say, well, we're ruining the planet, and this is obviously a terrible thing, and we have no right to do this, and we have no right to dominate over other species. We get accused of speciesism, analogous to racism. How dare you think you're better than a cockroach? Well, you notice it's always kind of specified. They compare you to, say, chimpanzees, but nobody carries the argument to its logical conclusion that you ought to give equal rights to cockroaches. Nor do they protest the horrors of the mass exterminations brought about by raid. In fact, we still even allow commercials. We don't allow commercials for smoking, but we allow commercials for raid. So this just doesn't make any sense. But we do have, so there are two extremes one can go to here, perhaps one could say. On the one hand, there's the idea that these lower things have rights. We mustn't violate them. But in so doing, those who say that fail to realize the basis of a right. What is a right? They fail to realize, which is the moral power to fulfill an obligation. They fail to realize that the notion of rights belongs only to persons, not to things, and not even to animals. The animals have no rights. And therefore, it is perfectly legitimate to subordinate their good to the good of man. So some people think, therefore, all right, we'll just go out and kill everything we can find, just for the pure sport of it. But we forget there's another aspect to this. We are rational beings. We're supposed to use reason in reference to the things that we find in nature. Those other things found in nature are put there by God just as well as we are. And therefore, there are certain reasonable demands, we won't go into them tonight, but there's reasonable demands that with respect to how we ought to behave in reference to these lower things. Not because they have rights, but because we are reasonable beings and ought to act reasonably. Thus, for instance, it is not ethical to wantonly torture an animal. Not because the animal has a right not to be tortured, but because it simply makes no sense to inflict pain upon anything unnecessarily. On the other hand, I've never seen anybody kind of hang back from taking care of a mosquito. I mean, we make these instantaneous ethical judgments that, that mosquito bothering me, getting rid of it is a higher order of reality and value and good than respecting its life. See? And yet, if you consider it in itself, the mosquito is a very perfect being. This gets into metaphysics. It's well designed for what it does. And after all, from its perspective, it's just having a little lunch. We just object to what's on the menu. But we do this instantaneous calculation that obliterating it is perfectly justified, even though it takes its entire life. And all it's doing is bothering us slightly. But that's because we are simultaneously judging the relative perfections of our lives. Is it discriminatory? Well, I guess it is. And I don't see very many people shying from that discrimination. I don't see even animal rights activists hesitating to swat a mosquito. Is there logical consistency here? That's the question. So anyway, good acts perfect man as a unitary whole. In other words, if an act is good, it's going to be good for the whole of our being in some way. And we're going to have to analyze. It's kind of complicated and tricky as to just how that works out in every instance. But fundamentally, the ethical life is one that is a life of repeated actions, deliberate and free actions, which are aimed at perfecting ourselves and perfecting, you might even say, the world in which we live, because that's also reasonable. The measure is always reason. Reason, though, as looking at human nature, what it's designed for, where it's supposed to be going, and how all of its integral parts function together so as to assist us towards that end. And so, there's many things people just instinctively know. If you ask them, is this right or this wrong? They already know these things, but the function of ethics is to try to figure out why we know some of these things. We know we're not supposed to go around chopping off people's heads. Everybody knows that, but then if you ask them, well, why not? Well, that's, it gets a little more complicated. And ethics gets us into the why not. And of course, not all things, not everybody agrees about everything. And therefore we will get into some matters that are a little more controversial. And being more controversial, again, you have to be a little more refined in your speculative analysis, your ethical analysis of what constitutes the truth regarding a particular ethical issue. What we're going to look at tonight, begin to look at, we'll never end looking at it, is the principle of double effect. I don't know why it appears here, but it's here in my notes, so we'll deal with it. Probably, I've given a bit of thought to this, because everything you do in life seems to be a matter of double effect. There isn't an action that we take. Every time we take a certain action, because we take this certain action, we are excluding certain other outcomes. If you decide to cross the street, in the act of crossing the street, you are risking the possibility of being run down by a car, which could end your life, which would be a horrible evil. Is it worth crossing the street? How do you justify just trying to get to the other side of the street when you could lose your life in the process? Now, we do this every day, and everybody does it. Everybody just automatically makes these kinds of decisions. In doing so, though, we are actually applying this principle of double effect. And the principle of double effect can be understood properly only in terms of being. Remember, being is the good. So everything that we do should be aimed at the good. Everything that we do should be aimed then at the maximization of being. Everything we do must be aimed at a good, and at a good that is proportionate and appropriate towards our last end and the perfection of our whole being. Well, how do we go through life seeking these goods in a world in which every time we act, there are side effects? That's why we get into this notion of double effect. The examples you see are very evident in a certain way, but I want you just to reflect on why it is basically everything that we do entails double effect. I've been trying to think for many years. I'm not trying to tell you this as a conclusion of an a priori demonstration. I'm just trying to tell you that thinking about it for many years, it occurs to me that there just doesn't seem to be a case where double effect doesn't come into play. If there is, please show me. But every time you do anything, the very fact that you choose to do this means you're not doing that. And if you're not doing that, there's certain things that happen because you're not doing that. If you sit down to read a book, you're not eating a hot dog. And because you're not eating the hot dog, you're not getting the nutrition of the hot dog. And maybe you're starving to death and you should be eating the hot dog. Instead, you're wasting your time reading a book. I'm just trying to get you to see that everything that we do, just, I take my car and go down this street. Well, going down this street means I don't go down that street. And that other street, I might have hit a car. Or it might be by going down this street, I do hit a car. And I don't see it coming. Now, there are unintended effects, you see. I wouldn't want to hit a car. Unintended consequences of certain acts. And usually when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about the things we are thinking about. We're talking about the things we're attending to. We're talking about deliberate acts. There's a lot of things that we do that we don't do deliberately. I mean, when you think of the function of habit, imagine playing short order cook. Ever think how many things you do in a kitchen when you're trying to throw a little lunch together? Most of which you're not even thinking about. All that you thought about was to make the lunch. And simultaneously you're doing a dozen things. Sometimes in the process you get burned because you're not really thinking about it all. A lot of it is just the product of habit because you fried a hamburger 100 times, 1,000 times before. You just automatically do it. So we've always got to filter out how much of this is conscious and deliberate, how much of it is just automatic, how much of it is habitual, how much of it were we not even giving thought to. When we talk about double effect, we're mostly thinking about the things that we're thinking about. We're thinking about the things that are deliberate. We're thinking about the things where we're concerned with the ethics of the outcome. But it's all ultimately rooted in a existential matrix of life in which everything we do is like a flow chart where one avenue going this way eliminates what goes over that way. Where one course of action has certain consequences and others don't. There's later on we may get to it, but if you want to talk about a double effect situation, you probably have heard about the classical case that was raised some years back where they talk about what's the ethics if you're on a trolley car and you can see ahead of you on the tracks a group of workmen, say 10 people working, and you're going to hit them. And you could see a side track you could go off onto, but there's one person standing on it. So is it ethical to turn onto that one track and knowing that you're going to kill this poor soul that would not have been touched otherwise? Is it just a matter of the greatest number, like the utilitarians would say? Well, I'll kill more over here than over there, so I try to kill the fewest. Am I allowed to kill him? Am I allowed to rejoice as I run the guy down? This is where you get into double effect. That's a more difficult issue. let's go back and look at this first example. These are all Dr. Waters' examples, by the way. You've seen them before. I plagiarized his notes. There's nothing new here. I'm not pretending there is. Question: how do you reconcile the evil of cutting off a leg with a surgical amputation? And of course, you have a little chart there. So I guess I don't have to put this on the board. And if anybody's listening to this on a CD, they're not going to see the board anyway. Oh, I see. Well, okay, so they do have it. Well, they have notes. They can look at their notes, all right? And everybody's got the same notes.
Some of us don't have the notes, maybe.
I'll have to presume you do, or will in the future. Even if you don't have notes, as you can see, the act of amputation has two results. It has a good result, which is the saving of somebody's life, and it has the evil result, which is the loss of the person's leg. Now, this gets into something where we have to be very careful and always ask ourselves, what am I doing? Because if you ask a surgeon what he's doing when he's making an amputation, he'll tell you, I'm cutting off this guy's leg, right?
Thanks a lot, Jay.
What else would he say? What is the purpose of the surgery? To remove the leg. Now, of course, that isn't really the purpose of the surgery, but that's what he's doing. And as he's thinking about it, he's trying to do it in a very good way so that the result of the surgery will be clean and neat and the patient will survive. What he's really trying to do, though, is to remove, let's say, the gangrene that is in the leg. Or even the fact that the leg is so badly mangled that it represents a threat to the person's life still being appended to the person's body. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that I'm really doing here? If my purpose is to cut off a leg, you imagine how horrible that is? What are you trying to do? I'm running around cutting off people's legs. Put it that way, how do you justify that? And yet there are surgeons doing it every day. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the moral nature of the act? What am I actually trying to do? Or what am I actually doing? Now, I'm not just saving the person's life by cutting off their leg. I am removing the gangrene. I am removing a threat to the person's life. So it's not like I justify a good end by an evil means. What I'm doing is using a means which entails, and this gets very complex, I guarantee you I'm going to get confused on some examples, just as you may find you're confused on some examples. But the general principle is clear. The act itself, what I'm actually doing, has to in itself be good or at least neutral, and what I am actually doing in removing this leg is removing a threat to the person's life. That's what I'm doing. In the process, the person loses his leg. That's an unfortunate side effect. Now you might say, well, let's say it's gangrene. I'm just removing the gangrene. Well, it's not that simple, because you can't just remove the gangrene. You have to cut that leg off in a certain way. And in doing it in a certain way that will make the surgery successful, I guarantee you've got to take off some good tissue too, don't you? That's why the ethics gets a little more complex. What am I doing? I'm removing this threat to the person's life, and I'm doing it in a fashion that will not endanger his life. That means that this procedure has to remove the leg or remove the gangrene in a safe manner. If I were to simply remove the gangrene, the patient might well die because of how obnoxious the surgery would be. So notice, the moral nature of the act is not cutting off the leg. The moral nature of the act is the removal of the disease or the danger to the person. So if you ask, what am I doing? The answer is not cutting off a leg. The answer is, I am removing this threat to the person's life. You can see how confusing this can be. We have also to make a distinction between the form of the act and the matter of the act. In the case of removing the leg, the subjective intention of the will, in other words, what is it am I doing? When I say, what am I doing? That's the formal or moral nature of the act. What I am doing is removing a threat to the person's life. What is the matter of the act? Objectively, that entails cutting the leg off. But the moral nature, in other words, what it is I am doing, which happens to be identical with cutting the leg off, is removing the threat to the person's life. Materially, it entails cutting off the leg. Formally, it entails removing this threat. And the measure of the morality is in terms of the formality. But be careful there, when you talk about the subjective intention, you're liable to get wrapped up in the end that you're trying to produce. And therefore justify an evil means to attain a good end. That's why it gets confusing to people. And thus somebody could say, I'm killing everybody who's got this contagious disease in order to protect everybody else, like a good utilitarian. Well, then the question is, well, can I kill you in order to save somebody else? Am I cutting off the leg, which I could not do if the leg were healthy? Am I cutting off the leg in order to save the person? See, I have to be doing something that by its nature is legitimate, and by its nature it's legitimate to cut off a diseased leg. By its nature it's not legitimate to kill a diseased person, because there are other factors involved. Persons, even as Kant says, are to be treated as ends in themselves and not as means to an end. Legs are different, because a leg is a part of a being, and the part can be sacrificed for the sake of the whole. See, already we're grabbing some other principles here, aren't we?
So why couldn't you, by that logic, sacrifice one ethnic group for the good of the whole society, the culture?
Well, that's exactly the same example I just gave you, where you got people that are diseased. The utilitarian would say, well, if we've got these people that are contagious, we can eliminate them. And of course, that's exactly the kind of attitude that the Nazis had with reference to the Jews. We'll just eliminate the threat by eliminating the people. The problem is that's not a legitimate means to an end, because the people have rights in themselves. A leg as such has rights, but the leg doesn't have a right, I'm sorry. But the leg as such has a function in reference to the person who has the rights. And that's why the leg is subordinate to the person, but the Jew is not subordinate to the Aryans. It's not a proper parallel. Moral good or moral evil. And we often talk about the subjective intention of the will. Remember, Kant says the only good thing is good will, and there is truth to that, very, very basic truth. And that's what we're talking about. Notice I have this little example of the moral good or moral evil in terms of what is primarily the elicited act of the will. And I have this little example taken out of the Bible, which I just begin. It says, whoever even looks at a woman with lust. When I wrote that down and just put ... I assumed that the reader would know what the rest of it was. Well, I made the mistake of using this with my classes, and you'd be amazed how many didn't have a clue how it finished. I'm sure you all do. Well, for anybody who's listening to this and doesn't know, whoever even looks at a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery with her. Which, of course, is what Christ himself said. And we have this lovely little distinction, which sometimes is missed. Sometimes people say, is a person, a sinner, the one who does evil? And this question, I believe, is a question that was put to Saint Bernadette when she was a little girl. And she answered, not one who does evil, which most people would say. She said, a sinner is one who loves evil. What an insight. There are many times we do evil through no fault of our own. We're just feckless human beings. We make mistakes. Usually everybody, no matter how evil they are, I always say it's just a mistake. You know, like, I didn't really do it, someone else did it. It's just a mistake. It's not a, heaven forbid, a sin.
That was very popular in Canada among politicians. I made honest mistake.
That's getting a twofer in there, isn't it? That way they can perhaps sound like they're an honest politician at the same time. But it is a beautiful insight to realize that the evil rests in what the will loves. It's not what we do. We often do things where we just, we're just walking around in a fog. We don't even know how these things happened. That's not moral evil. It may be stupidity. You might get into the question of, well, do you have a moral obligation not to be so stupid? Sometimes that's the case. Anyway, let's get to the conditions for double effect. And this is all metaphysics. This is all metaphysics because it's simply that in every act we perform, we are morally obliged to seek the good and do the good, which means to perfect being. I don't even have to look at those four criteria. I'm not even thinking about what they are. Double effect has to mean that we are always acting toward the good. And if you look at the principles, I think you'll find no violation of that. Number one, the act in itself must be good, or at least neutral. It must not in itself be evil. So what I am doing, and that of course entails the form of the act. And now you might say, well, what about the matter of the act? Well, in some cases, the matter of the act is such that you can't separate it from the form. I mean, if the matter of the act is being cruel, it's pretty hard to separate it from the form. So the act at least has to be neutral. Now, how is cutting off a leg neutral? Well, the fact is, what I'm doing is I'm just sawing. It was said during the Civil War, they didn't have enough anesthetic to go around, and that sometimes they just ran out of whiskey. So the only thing they could do was to do it as fast as possible, and they used two saws, one to cut through the flesh and the other to cut through the bone. And that's where they got the term sawbones. As we're meeting a physician, sawbones. A good physician, good surgeon, could take a leg off in about 30 seconds. Probably seemed a bit longer to the patient. But what were they doing? They weren't trying to inflict pain. They were trying to save the person's life by removing a leg that was so badly injured that it would have killed the person. It would have bled to death, for example. The act in itself is one of simply removing the threat. And if you can saw faster than somebody else, you're doing a better job of it. Both effects, the good effect and the bad effect, must flow directly from the act. So the act, in the case of cutting off the leg or removing the threat, to be more precise, what I'm doing is sawing, basically. And in that result of the sawing, two things happen. The person's life is saved, we hope, and at the same time, the leg is lost. Both of these are effects that come directly from the act of sawing. With equal immediacy, and assuredly that the evil effect cannot be viewed as or understood as a means to the good end. That, of course, is the essence of utilitarianism, pragmatism, instrumentalism, and all the other so-called ethical systems of that ilk, situationism. The good effect alone is intended. In other words, you can't come out of the operating theater and say, hey, I just made this guy a cripple. You know, isn't that wonderful? So you're not allowed to rejoice in the effect that is bad. That's not permissible. And that, of course, is a hard one to avoid sometimes, because human nature being what it is. I mean, this is like the people that used to, out west, go to a good hanging. It was a day for a festival. Get out the hot dogs and hamburgers and get the kids and bring them to a good hanging. No, that's not permissible, even if, and I'm not yet to the point of discussing capital punishment, but whether capital punishment is morally good or morally bad, it is never licit to rejoice in the suffering and the evil of the person being put to death, any more than it would be right to rejoice in the fact that poor Joe isn't going to have a leg anymore after I amputate it. And number 4, due proportion. And that just amounts to saying that of these effects that are produced, the good effect outweighs or at least is equal to the evil effect permitted. Notice we make the distinction between what we will and what we permit. You can only will the good. You permit the evil. And notice, being is being followed in each case. The act itself must be good or neutral. You're acting towards something that is legitimate being. Of the effects that flow, you can only intend the good effect. You permit the evil effect. And you always do more good than harm, or at least as much good as harm. And sometimes we get into places where what we are doing, no matter what we do, something bad's going to happen. But we can't will what is evil. I mean, sometimes if you stand where you are, something bad will happen, and if you move, something bad will happen. So that the application of double effect there is simply that you make sure you're not doing more harm than good by standing where you are. In terms of application, best known example of this is medicine. And you know it full well. Every time you get something from the pharmacist, you get this whole list of side effects. In fact, I notice on a lot of medicine, they don't tell you what it's for. They only tell you what it does to you that you don't want. And the list of side effects seems to be infinite.
That's in 4-point type.
Right. And it seems invariably on most real drugs, if you read down far enough, one of the side effects is called death. And you're sitting there wondering, well, wait a minute, how does this get justified? How does that work out with due proportion? And there's some drugs where it just doesn't seem to work. I always love to think of the example of the drug that came out for toenail fungus. Have you ever heard about that one? Number one, it costs something like $800 for a treatment, and your insurance won't cover it. Well, maybe it will under Obamacare. I don't know. Number two, the drug itself has horrible side effects, including possible destruction of, I think it's your liver, which may result in death. And the final little kicker is it only works maybe 40% of the time. Oh, this is a real good drug. I mean, apply double effect to it. Most people don't apply double effect to it, they just don't take it. And sometimes, drugs that are on the market come close to that analysis. And in fact, sometimes they get taken off the market because even from a medical perspective, they obviously don't pass this analysis. And what many people don't realize is that most drugs you take are considered successful if they work 30 to 40% of the time, or for 30 to 40% of the people. Have you ever noticed that's why you go to your physician and he says, try this? And then you tell him, but doc, it didn't work. He says, okay, we'll try that. You say, well, that didn't work either. Okay, well, we'll try this. This is called the practice of medicine. Because in truth, many times you just don't know what's going to work. But the justification is, and they often tell you right in the literature, it says all these bad things could happen from this drug, but the reason you're taking it, you have to talk to your physician and let him judge whether the risk is justified by the beneficial effect. That's double effect in spades. Now, how do you justify taking a drug to, I don't know, cure your asthma or control your asthma if one of the side effects could be death, sudden death? In fact, I think there's one being advertised on TV right now that does that. They have to tell you all the things it can cause, and one of them they have to say right on TV is sudden death. I often wonder who's doing their advertising budget here? Who's come to the conclusion that this will sell the drug instead of scaring people out of not taking it? The real problem is I think often it scares patients who need the drug into not taking it because they heard the commercial. But how could you justify taking a drug for a condition that's not life-threatening in itself? Many times they're not, when the drug itself could kill you. How do you justify it? Where's the due proportion? Let me give you a different example, then you'll find a bit easier. Go back to crossing the street. Every time you cross the street, you take a chance that you're going to get run over by a truck. So how do you justify crossing the street? Maybe you should never cross another street. How do you justify it? You say, well, I'll look both ways. Okay, sometimes we look both ways and we still get run over by the truck.
Probability.
Exactly. If you look at all of these side effects, they are all they'll give you, based on the statistics of experimenting on people, they will give you the number of people who get the side effects. Some of them are considered common, frequent, rare, or very rare. And they get down to something like 1% or under 1%. And presumably the ones that say death are so rare that there is a due proportion. Not a proportion in terms of the effect that could be produced, but the effect when combined with probability gives you a due proportion. Thus, crossing the street, most of the time you'll make it. And in fact, we make it so often that we consider the risk of death so slight, although possible, that we normally cross the street. Once in a while, we get flattened. But it doesn't mean it's an irrational decision to have crossed the street all those other times until it happens. So medicine is a perfect example. And sometimes you'll see in the literature that it will tell you that we've studied 50,000 patients and 5 of them died, but then they'll say, but it isn't totally clear that they died because of our drug. So that's another mitigating factor. It might have been something else that killed them.
The one that was intriguing to me was the mortality rate of C-section births, cesarean births, is 3 times higher than conventional vaginal births.
Right. Yeah.
And
You begin to wonder.
you look at both, and you're crossing the street in both predicaments. But so many women elect to have C-section.
Electively,
Yeah.
purely electively,
Because of the
convenience. Yeah, well, that of course then raises the question of the ethical justification of such an act. Because that there would not seem to be a due proportion. The principle also, in the case of removing the leg, is that the part may be sacrificed for the good of the whole. Because the end of the part, the end of the leg, is the end of the whole. The reason that you have legs is to help you live, help you be able to move around and do things as a complete human being. But it's better to be alive than to be a complete human being that dies. So the end of the part can be sacrificed for the sake of the end of the whole. The leg exists to serve the whole animal. Let's see if we have time to take, let's just do the next one, which is self-defense. Now, of course, do we have a right of self-defense? Do we have a right to kill somebody trying to attack us? You might say, well, just ward off what they're doing. But you see, if somebody's going to, let's say, hit you in the face, if you put your hand up to stop them, that's self-defense. We say, well, that's only defensive. Well, you might break their wrist as they're hitting you because you put your hand in the way. This is the very nature of self-defense. It's an action which is designed to prevent an attack from succeeding. And when you act to prevent attack from succeeding, you may hurt the attacker. And of course, the general principle is you want to maximize being, so you don't want to defend yourself any more than is absolutely necessary to defend yourself. You have a right to defend yourself because you have a right to life. You have a right to the integrity of your body. So but somebody's coming around trying to break your arm, they are violating your rights. All right, so you have therefore the moral power to prevent them from doing this. But in the exercise of that, you might in fact kill the other person. That's possible. We can get into all kinds of examples of how one might do that, but the general principle is what you are doing, the moral nature of the act, is you are removing the attack. You're stopping the attack, you're removing the attacker. That's all that you are permitted to do. And that's precisely why if one shot will stop an attacker, you don't have the right to empty the gun into him. That's in courts of law even, that's frowned upon. So in the process, the 2 ends result from the act, saving my life, possibly even losing the life of the other person. There's a due proportion. It's one life against another. Notice you can do this even if the person attacking you is insane. Because what you're responding to is the matter of the act, not the form. You have no way of knowing their intention. And even if you know them to be insane, you still have the right to respond to the matter of the attack, which is the actual physical attack they're making upon you. Note also, though, that this defense of yourself is a right. It is not an obligation. You don't have to resist an attack. But you have the right to do so. And there again, you see, that's where Kantian ethics doesn't quite fit. Because according to Kant, you've always got to do what duty demands. Well, that doesn't cover the fact that sometimes you can defend yourself and other times you don't have to.
But what about the father of the family? I mean,
Well, he's not defending himself there. Well, he could be defending himself because he has an obligation to care for his family. That's right. Well, that only allows that you may fail to defend yourself, assuming that you do not have some other obligation for defending yourself. And of course, that gets into all the complexity of the possible ways. But this is why you may even use deadly force to defend yourself. Joe?
Would it then be a right not to defend yourself? Or would the right just be you have a right to defend yourself?
You have a right to defend yourself.
But if
You
not,
don't
you
need,
not be killed?
you need not exercise that right. You can always not exercise a right that you have unless you have a superseding obligation to exercise the right.
But would you consider that a right? Do you have a right not to exercise your right? I mean, is that?
A right is a moral power to fulfill an obligation. So the question is, do you have an obligation to preserve your life when someone is attacking it? If you don't have an obligation, then you would, I don't know, would you say, I don't know that you'd say you have the right to not do it. I guess you could say you have the right to not defend it.
I used to take students in campus ministry to a peace retreat in Massachusetts, and they were totally against any kind of aggressive action. And the one woman said that, and she was a Buffalo gal from upstate originally, she said that if somebody stopped her when she was on walking along and threatened her, that she would not take an aggressive action, but she would speak to the person, okay, and try to look in the eyes and try to calm the person. Now, that would be different. That would be more, I think, what Joe was saying, right?
Yes.
Standing back.
Yeah, oh yeah, you could.
Right. So that's, her right would be to push him off if he had a gun or something.
If she wanted to exercise the
Right.
right, but you're not obliged
You're
to
not
exercise
obliged
the
to
right.
do that. Yeah.
If somebody is obstructing a law, and so the policeman takes that as an aggressive act, I don't know the exact circumstances, I know what the situation happened, and the policeman shot the man and he was killed. You could have been a bit of a tough customer, but I don't know all the details, but would that, did the policeman overdo this, or you don't know the circumstances?
Well, you're not talking about the policeman defending himself, you're talking about the policeman enforcing a law. That's a different matter. Here, we're only talking about defending your person. Defending your person, defending your body, let us say. And you have a right to do this. You may, it's like a woman who's being raped. She has a right to kill the rapist. But she also has the right to not kill him if she may, for example, conclude that if I kill him now, he'll go straight to hell. And I don't will that for anybody. So she may not, for that reason, physically resist. She's obliged morally to internally resist in terms of her will. She can't consent to the act, of course. But the point is, she's not obliged to kill the guy. That's a different matter.
The policeman might have considered that this, in fact, was the danger.
That's why you need to know the details of the case.
Pardon me?
That's why you need to know the details of the case. You have to know the details before you can settle it. That's why ethical
But
contexts are
let's say that was the
complicated.
case. Let's say that was the case. He saw that as a threat to his life, so he took the gun or whatever and shot at the guy, and that was it.
All right. Well, the complexity of the policeman is that in some cases he would have the right to shoot the person, even if they were not threatening. And he would be, because he's enforcing the law, he is doing something that is morally justified, even though that person isn't threatening him or isn't killing him. So if he's defending himself against the person, then you have the complexity that, one, he's got the right to defend his person, and at the same time, he has the obligation to enforce the law.
Or defend the community.
That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing when you enforce the law.
But the law in China is forced abortion. So when
Well, not every law is a just law.
That's right.
Not every law is a just law. See, that's why it gets very complex. We're starting with a very general analysis, very general. You know, you got to crawl before you walk. And we're trying to understand the general principles before we get into the concrete cases. Concrete cases are so complex that, as I think I may have mentioned to you previously, I wound up with a theologian and another philosopher debating at great length, something that you're familiar with here, Mr. Bonnette, at great length, a particular ethical issue where good people all together, you know, everybody's on the same side, we're all Thomists, using the same principles, could not readily come to the same conclusion. But that's way down the road on a very particular, very unusual case. The general principles are what we first understand. This is general ethics.
That's what we start with.
Yes, where you start. It's kindergarten ethics, if you will. It doesn't mean when you walk out of going through all of this, you will be an expert officiant. No, and I'm sorry. It doesn't even, and it doesn't even mean that I'm an expert officiant to be able to teach this, because we're doing the general principles. We're trying to understand generally how this is done.
And that's why, too, I mean, moving it over into something like confession, sometimes a priest will say to a penitent, may I ask another priest about your
Yes.
case? Because he has all this training,
Right, right.
but he's still, it's, you know, some of the things they're hit with are,
Can I go check McFadden?
yeah.
Exactly.
On what basis does a rape victim have the right to
Due
take the
proportion.
life of
Due
her
proportion.
attacker?
It has been generally held that you have the right to use force to the point even of killing another person if the good which they threaten is either your life or a good considered equivalent to life. And not being raped has traditionally been understood as a good equivalent to life. It's just like, for example, if you, in the Old West, you steal my horse, I hang you. Why? Well, you didn't kill me, but if you take my horse away, I can't live. So effectively, you're killing me. So there are some goods that are held to be equivalent to life.
But that seems to me a material argument, whereas in the rape case, it's primarily a psychological one.
I try to tell a woman it's just a psychological problem. I think that is to misunderstand the nature of rape.
No, I mean, I don't mean to de-emphasize the criminality of
So-
the act. I want to understand what the philosophical
Okay,
basis is
let-
for establishing a proportionality.
Well, let's say that somebody is just going to splash acid in your face so you'll never look like a human being again. That might be proportionate to it. And surely you have the right to stop them. And when you say you got the right to stop them, it means you may do whatever is required to stop them from doing it because of the due proportion to what they're doing to you. That entails possibly even killing them.
Because
But
it strikes me that there's a problem where, for some people, words have a very deep psychological and long-lasting trauma. And if we don't have a very
Right. clear
clear idea of where that boundary lies, at which point can we reciprocate by taking the life of our attacker or our victim?
Right,
So if we don't have a very clear understanding.
I don't think it's just a matter of words, though, because what you're doing is violating the personal integrity of somebody in a way that is just incommensurable to anything else. And that, of course, is better understood by women than by men. But the fact that this can be is not tolerated by any society. For example, It isn't just a matter of the person being raped having the right to kill the rapist. Rape has traditionally been one of the capital offenses in most societies. It's only in relatively recent times that we give a rapist 7 years in jail or something, or community service, depending on what they run into. But traditionally, it's been something for which a person could be executed. So the justification is because it is so central to the very life and welfare of both the individual and the community. Joe?
Wouldn't also the element come in to play where you don't know how far the rape is gonna go? In other words, a lot of rapists will kill a person. So
Right.
if you're being raped, you know, you can't just say, well, it's just gonna be a rape and nothing else is gonna happen.
but-
You don't know how far he's gonna go.
That's true.
But that's the same with the robber.
True.
Somebody
That's
The
true.
robber-
And that's why you can also shoot a robber.
Yeah, the robber doesn't, the robber doesn't show the gun. It's like the gun doesn't
But
show.
please remember the counterbalancing principle that if you can totally prevent the attack without killing the person, you are not permitted to kill the person.
Yeah.
This is the complexity here. So you've got to balance things, keep a due proportion.
It's hard to know it when you have to make a split decision.
That is, okay, that's fine. I grant sometimes in the context, you can't fault a person's decision. They may have, and that's why we have courts of law, we have juries to weigh these mitigating circumstances. But remember, we're trying to get the basic principle here. Basic principle for self-defense is, if you're going to come up and hit me, do I have the right at least to stop your blow? If I got the right to stop your blow in principle, I have justified self-defense, because in stopping your blow, you could get hurt, and the rest of it just flows from that. If I have the right to stop you by raising my hand, I therefore have the right to stop you by some other means. It's possible in some cases, even lethal means.
There's a physical force during the rape, so you have the right to physical defense. And sometimes happen, two men were fighting each other, one hit one man, the other one punched him, and the other guy fell down, hit his head over the curb and died.
That's right.
And he wasn't intended to kill him, he was just...
Right. Well, this, again, remember, we're dealing with very general principles, but we've got to apply them to very complex, concrete cases. And that's why you say, well, is this always justified or that never justified? It isn't that there aren't universal principles, there are, but many of these principles have to be applied, and sometimes it's difficult to determine in a concrete case which is the supervening principle, or what is the moral nature of the act. What was the formal nature of the act? What was the material nature of the act? We have to sort all that out in order to figure it out. And of course, sometimes you can have people at length trying to figure out a most difficult case, even experts, and not quickly coming to a conclusion. That's why in ordinary living, you can understand how people often will make mistakes where they do things that are materially evil, but they weren't formally evil, and we can't judge them as such because of the complexity of the circumstances. But that doesn't mean there wasn't an objective truth or an ethical truth in the situation. It's just that the person couldn't figure it out fast enough, and they did the best they could, which comes back to recognizing a good will as the measure of the legitimacy of the person's conscience and of their morality. But that doesn't totally subjectivize the ethics. All the way through here, we're going to be balancing between subjective elements and objective elements. Ethics is not easy, and that's why everybody wants to start out in ethics. When I was going through graduate school, everybody wanted to do ethics. Everybody wanted to be an ethician. Looks like lots of fun, but they didn't want to do the metaphysics. They didn't want to do the epistemology. They didn't want to do the psychology that you had to do to properly prepare to do the ethics. And therefore, you wind up with a lot of incompetent ethicians. And this one has to stop for the night. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.